The Cold War was one of the defining moments of the 20th century, shaping the world we live in today. It was a time of heightened tensions, fears, and the possibility of nuclear annihilation. A period of intense political and military tension between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, that lasted from the end of World War II to the early 1990s. In this video, we'll explore the origins of the Cold War, its key events, and the long-lasting consequences it had on the world. The origins of the Cold War. The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to the end of World War II, when the victorious Allied powers began to divide up Europe and Asia. The Potsdam Conference, held in 1945, was one of the first major meetings between the leaders of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain after the war. It was here that the seeds of the Cold War were sown, with disagreements over the fate of Germany, the future of Poland, and other issues. Lack of trust between the United States and Soviet Union was a key factor in the origins of the Cold War, as both sides saw the other as a threat to their strategic interests. The Soviet Union viewed the United States as an imperialist power seeking to dominate the world, while the United States saw the Soviet Union as a dangerous expansionist force seeking to spread communism. The ideological divide between the two superpowers, with the United States promoting democracy and capitalism while the Soviet Union espoused communism and a centrally planned economy. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, sought to expand its influence into Eastern Europe, while the Western powers, led by the United States, sought to contain the spread of communism. The differences between these two systems, along with ideological and geopolitical tensions, set the stage for a confrontation that would last for decades. The Cold War was characterized by a series of events that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. From the Berlin blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were high. The arms race and the space race were just some of the ways in which the two nations tried to outdo each other. Truman Doctrine. In 1947, U.S. President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, a policy of containment aimed at preventing the spread of communism. This marked a turning point in the Cold War, as the United States became committed to opposing the Soviet Union and its allies wherever they tried to expand their influence. The doctrine was sparked by the Greek Civil War, where communist rebels were fighting against the Greek government. Truman saw the conflict as a threat to the security of Europe and the world, and he requested that Congress provide military aid to Greece and Turkey to help them resist communism. Truman argued that the United States had a responsibility to support countries threatened by communism and to prevent the spread of Soviet influence around the world. He called for a global effort to contain communism, which became known as the policy of containment. The Truman Doctrine was a significant moment in the early years of the Cold War, as it marked a shift in American foreign policy towards a more interventionist approach. It also set the stage for other Cold War policies, such as the Marshall Plan and the NATO alliance, which aimed to strengthen the economies and militaries of Western Europe to resist Soviet influence. The Berlin blockade. It began in June 1948, when the Soviet Union blockaded all ground, rail, and water access to the Western-occupied sectors of Berlin, which had been located deep within the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. The blockade was in response to the United States, Britain, and France's decision to merge their zones of occupation and create a single, democratic West German state. The Soviet Union saw this as a threat to their influence in Germany and Europe and responded with the blockade. The blockade lasted for almost a year, during which time the Western powers were forced to airlift food, fuel, and supplies into Berlin. This operation, known as the Berlin Airlift, was a massive logistical undertaking that involved hundreds of planes and thousands of people. Despite the challenges, the airlift was successful, and the people of Berlin were kept supplied throughout the blockade. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major event in the Cold War that occurred in October 1962. It was a tense 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over the placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba. The crisis began when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy immediately convened a group of advisors to develop a response. The options included a military strike on the missile sites or a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments. After much deliberation, Kennedy chose to implement a naval blockade, which he called the quarantine of Cuba to prevent further Soviet missiles from reaching the island. This move was risky, as it could have escalated into a full-scale war between the two superpowers. However, it also allowed time for diplomatic negotiations to take place. The Soviet Union initially refused to back down, and tensions continued to rise. However, after several days of negotiations, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Korean War. Another main event of the Cold War was the Korean War that took place from 1950 to 1953. It was fought between North Korea, which was supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Korea, which was supported by the United States and other United Nations forces. The war began when North Korea invaded South Korea in an attempt to reunify the country under communist rule. The United States and other UN forces intervened to stop the spread of communism and protect South Korea. The war was a brutal conflict that resulted in the deaths of millions of people and left the Korean peninsula divided between a communist North and a democratic South. It also had broader implications for the Cold War, as it demonstrated the willingness of the United States to use military force to contain the spread of communism. The Korean War also marked a turning point in the Cold War, as it led to a shift in Soviet foreign policy towards a more conciliatory approach. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had initially supported North Korea's invasion, but he later backed down in the face of the United States military response. The war also led to a significant expansion of American military power, as the United States established a significant military presence in South Korea and other parts of Asia to deter future aggression from communist powers. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War that took place from 1955 to 1975 was among the events that sparked due to the Cold War. The war was fought between North Vietnam, which was supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States and other Western powers. The war began as a result of the growing influence of communism in Southeast Asia, and the United States saw Vietnam as a critical battleground in the global struggle against communism. The United States intervened to support South Vietnam and prevent the spread of communism, but the conflict quickly became a quagmire that lasted for over a decade. The Vietnam War led to significant social and political upheaval in the United States, as many Americans protested against the war and called for an end to American involvement. The war also had significant implications for the Cold War, as it demonstrated the limits of American military power and the difficulty of winning a war against a committed guerrilla force. It also led to a shift in Soviet foreign policy, as the Soviet Union sought to expand its influence in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. The Soviet Afghan War. The Soviet Afghan War that lasted between 1979 and 1989 was a display of Cold War conflicts on the international scene. The Soviet forces fought the Afghan rebels who were supported by the United States and other Western powers. The war began when Soviet forces intervened in Afghanistan to support the communist government, which was facing a growing insurgency. The United States and other Western powers saw the intervention as a threat to regional stability and a potential expansion of Soviet influence in the Middle East. The war also had significant impacts on Soviet society and military power, as it exposed the limitations of the Soviet military and led to growing dissent and disillusionment among the Soviet population. The war also had broader implications for the Cold War, as it demonstrated the difficulty of winning a war in a foreign country and the limits of Soviet power projection. It also had significant consequences for the United States and the Muslim world, as it led to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and the growth of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda. The fall of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the main event of the Cold War, followed later by the collapse of the Soviet Union. The event took place on November 9, 1989. The Berlin Wall had been a symbol of the Cold War division between East and West, and its fall marked the beginning of a new era of unity and cooperation between the two sides. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a result of growing pressure from the East German population for greater political freedoms and economic opportunities. The Soviet Union, which had been the dominant power in East Germany, had also begun to shift towards a more conciliatory approach to the West. The fall of the Berlin Wall had significant implications for the Cold War, as it marked a turning point in the struggle between communism and democracy. It demonstrated the growing strength of democratic movements in Eastern Europe and the limitations of Soviet power. The fall of the Berlin Wall also paved the way for the reunification of Germany, which had been divided since the end of World War II. The reunification of Germany had significant economic and political implications for Europe and the world, as it led to the formation of a stronger, more unified Germany and a more stable and prosperous Europe. The collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the turning point in modern history and marked the beginning of a new era of democratic and capitalist expansion. The collapse was gradually taking place between the late 1980s and early 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the result of a combination of internal and external factors, including economic stagnation, political corruption, and the growing pressure for political freedoms and democratic reforms. The collapse of the Soviet Union had significant implications for the Cold War, as it marked the end of the ideological conflict between communism and democracy that had dominated international relations for decades. It also had significant geopolitical implications, as it led to the emergence of new independent states in Eastern Europe and Central Asia and a shift in the balance of power towards the United States and its Western allies. The collapse of the Soviet Union also had significant economic implications, as it led to the transition of many former Soviet countries to market-based economies and the growth of global capitalism. The Cold War consequences. The Cold War had significant consequences for the world, both during and after the conflict. Some of the most important consequences of the Cold War include globalization. The Cold War marked the beginning of a new era of globalization, as the world became increasingly interconnected through trade, technology, and communication. Arms race. The arms race between the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War led to the development of advanced weapons systems, including nuclear weapons. This arms race had significant implications for global security and contributed to the development of mutual deterrence strategies. Regional conflicts. The Cold War led to numerous regional conflicts, including the Korean War, Vietnam War, and Soviet Afghan War. These conflicts had significant human and economic costs and had long-term impacts on the regions affected. Proxy wars. The Cold War led to the development of proxy wars, where the United States and Soviet Union supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world. These proxy wars often had significant impacts on local populations and contributed to the destabilization of many countries. Space race. The Cold War led to a competition between the United States and Soviet Union in space exploration, culminating in the first moon landing by the United States in 1969. Technological advancements. The Cold War also led to significant technological advancements, including the development of the Internet, GPS, and other technologies that have transformed the world. The consequences of the Cold War were far-reaching and continue to shape our world today. The legacy of the Cold War can be seen in the conflicts that continue to rage around the world today. From the ongoing war in Ukraine, and the tensions between the US and Russia, the Cold War has left a lasting impact on our world. The Cold War had a profound impact on the world, shaping global politics, economics, and society for decades to come. Its legacy can still be felt today in many areas of international relations, and has played a significant role in shaping the world we live in today. The Cold War was a defining period in world modern history that shaped the course of international relations for decades. It was a conflict that was defined by ideological differences, regional conflicts, and proxy wars, as well as the arms race and space race. As we reflect on the Cold War today, it is important to recognize its ongoing impact on the world order and the continued relevance of the lessons learned from this period of history. By studying the origins and consequences of the Cold War, we can gain a better understanding of the complexities of international relations and the need for continued efforts towards peace, diplomacy, and cooperation. If you like our videos, please support by subscribing to our channel. Thank you.